The Wanderer in the Mirror by Brandon Crowder. In the silence of an old forgotten mansion, a wanderer arrives, seeking a new beginning, only to find himself trapped in a place where reality unravels, and every reflection hides a secret. From author Brandon Crowder comes a supernatural thriller that will haunt your every thought. Who or what is the Wanderer in the Mirror? Coming soon. Don't look too closely, or you might see something looking back. Chapter 1. The House of Forgotten Faces. The narrow country road twisted through the trees like a serpent, its black ribbon barely wide enough for Daniel's car to pass. Shadows stretched long and thin as the late afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting a dim golden glow that clung to the landscape. The windshield wipers squeaked across the glass, clearing the mist that had begun to settle over the fields. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter, the silence in the car pressing down on him like a weight. Even the radio had given up trying to fill the emptiness. He knew the house was close. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing unease that had been growing stronger ever since he left the main highway and turned onto the back roads. His GPS had stopped working an hour ago, leaving him to rely on vague directions from the lawyer's office. "You'll know it when you see it," they'd said, their tone almost dismissive. "It's impossible to miss." As if on cue, the trees parted, and there it was. The mansion loomed ahead, its decaying grandeur barely visible through the thick fog that seemed to cling to the structure. Daniel slowed the car to a crawl, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the place. The house was massive, 3 stories tall with gabled roofs and narrow windows that gave it the appearance of a skeletal face, watching him with dark, hollow eyes. Ivy crawled up the stone walls like veins, weaving in and out of the cracked mortar, and the once grand front porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect. He pulled the car to a stop at the edge of the gravel driveway, the tires crunching over the stones. The engine's hum faded into silence as he turned off the ignition, leaving only the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. Daniel sat there for a moment, staring at the house. The air inside the car was suddenly too thick, too still. He rolled down the window, hoping for a breeze, but the air outside was heavy, damp, and smelled faintly of moss and decay. Well, he thought, I guess this is it. With a resigned sigh, Daniel opened the door and stepped out into the evening fog. The gravel shifted beneath his boots as he made his way to the front of the car. The house loomed above him now, its black silhouette cutting against the darkening sky. There was something oppressive about its presence, as though the house itself was aware of him standing there, an intruder in a place where he didn't belong. He glanced at the front door. It was made of thick, heavy wood, and despite the peeling paint, it looked sturdy. An old-fashioned knocker hung in the center, a brass lion's head that had long since lost its shine. Daniel reached for it, hesitated, then pulled his hand back. He shook his head, annoyed with himself. It's just a house. He fumbled with the keys the lawyer had given him and unlocked the door. The hinges groaned as the door swung inward, revealing a wide foyer bathed in deep shadows. The smell hit him first, a mix of damp wood, dust, and something else, something metallic. The air inside was colder than it should have been, almost biting against his skin despite the humidity outside. Daniel stepped inside, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. The foyer was large, with a grand staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and a cracked chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its glass blades clinking together in the breeze from the open door. Dust motes danced in the dying light that filtered through the narrow windows, giving the space a ghostly quality. He closed the door behind him, the sound reverberating through the empty house. It felt like a tomb. Daniel stood there, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. His breath was shallow, his heart beating a little too fast. This wasn't how it was supposed to feel. He had imagined this moment for weeks, moving into the house that was supposed to be his fresh start, a new chapter after the shit show of a breakup. But standing here now, the weight of the house pressing down on him, all he felt was trapped. He shook his head, forcing the thoughts away. He was just tired. It had been a long drive, and the exhaustion was making him jumpy. He dropped his bag onto the floor and rubbed his eyes. Just get some rest. You'll feel better in the morning. There was a light switch by the door, but when he flipped it, nothing happened. The house remained shrouded in darkness. Great. He fumbled for his phone, using the flashlight to navigate his way through the foyer. The beam of light flickered as he moved, casting long, jagged shadows that stretched across the walls. The hallway stretched ahead of him, leading deeper into the house. As he walked, his footsteps echoed unnervingly in the empty space. Old portraits lined the walls, their eyes following him as he passed. Most of the faces were obscured by years of dust and grime, but one in particular stood out. A woman, her pale face framed by a cascade of dark hair. Her eyes were sharp, too sharp as though she could see straight through him. Daniel shivered and looked away. At the end of the hall, he found the kitchen. It was just as neglected as the rest of the house. Counters covered in a thin layer of dust, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling corners, and an old cast-iron stove that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the grime of the day settling on him. A shower. That's what he needed. Just a quick rinse to shake off the drive and the eerie feeling clinging to him, like the fog outside. He found the bathroom on the second floor, a cramped space with cracked tiles and a rust-stained sink. The mirror above it was cloudy, the glass warped with age. As Daniel set his phone on the counter, its light casting an eerie glow over the room, he caught a flicker of movement in the reflection. He froze. His eyes snapped to the mirror, but there was nothing there, just his reflection staring back at him, the tired lines on his face more pronounced in the harsh light. He laughed, the sound shaky in the empty room. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. "It's just an old house." The shower sputtered to life, the pipes groaning as water trickled out. It took a few minutes, but eventually, the flow became steady enough to use. Daniel stripped off his clothes and stepped into the tub, letting the lukewarm water wash over him. For a moment, he closed his eyes and tried to relax, tried to let the water carry away the tension that had settled deep in his muscles. But the feeling of being watched never left. Daniel stood in front of the mirror again, rubbing a towel through his damp hair. His skin prickled with the cold air that seeped through the cracked window. The mirror was fogged over from the steam, and for a second, he considered wiping it clean. But something about the idea felt wrong. He glanced at the distorted shape of his reflection, a vague outline in the misted glass, and decided to leave it as it was. He turned off the bathroom light and stepped into the hallway. The house was silent, save for the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath his feet. He had set up his bed in one of the guest rooms, just a mattress on the floor for now, until he could figure out how to move the larger pieces of furniture. The room was sparsely decorated, with faded floral wallpaper and a large bay window that looked out over the front lawn. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft, silver glow over the space. Daniel collapsed onto the mattress, exhausted. He pulled the covers over himself and stared up at the ceiling. The quiet was almost oppressive, the kind of silence that felt heavy, like it was pressing down on his chest. He could hear his own heartbeat in the stillness, each thump echoing in his ears. But it wasn't just the silence that bothered him. It was the feeling of being watched. He rolled over, facing the window, and closed his eyes. "It's just your imagination," he told himself. "You're alone here." But the feeling wouldn't go away. Even with his eyes closed, he could feel it, like a pair of eyes boring into the back of his head. He shifted uncomfortably, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. Sleep didn't come easily. Sometime in the middle of the night, Daniel awoke to a soft creaking sound. His eyes snapped open, and for a moment, he lay still, his heart hammering in his chest. The room was bathed in shadows, the pale moonlight barely reaching the edges of the bed. The house was silent again, but the creak had been real. He was sure of it. He sat up slowly, straining to listen. Nothing. His pulse began to slow, and he exhaled, lying back down. "It's just an old house," he thought. "Old houses make noise. Relax." But just as he was about to close his eyes again, he heard it, a soft rhythmic creak. Like footsteps, slow and deliberate, they echoed down the hallway outside his room. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes flicked to the door, but it was still closed, the faint light from the hallway leaking in through the crack at the bottom. He strained to listen, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then they stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. Daniel's fingers tightened around the blanket, his muscles tense. His mouth went dry. The door creaked open. The darkness beyond the door was absolute, swallowing the faint light that spilled into the room. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the open doorway, half expecting to see something, someone, standing there, watching him from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the oppressive weight of the silence. His mind raced, heart pounding in his ears. He had locked the front door when he came in. He had checked it twice. There was no way anyone could have. A soft shuffle of movement, barely audible, drifted from the hallway. Daniel's blood ran cold. His hand tightened around the blanket, his body frozen in place. He could hear it now. The faint, uneven sound of breathing. It wasn't his. Slowly he reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as they closed around the device. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow across the room, but the light didn't reach the hallway. With shaking hands, he turned on the flashlight, aiming it toward the open door. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty hallway. There was no one there, but the breathing continued. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse racing. He swung the light back toward the bed, half expecting to see something looming over him, but the room was empty. His breathing grew shallow, panic clawing at the edges of his mind. The sound of footsteps returned, soft and deliberate. This time, they were coming from behind him. Daniel spun around, the flashlight shaking in his hand, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, completely empty. He was alone. But the breathing, God, the breathing, it was everywhere. Daniel thought the house was just old, abandoned. But some places remember, some places never forget. As the shadows grow deeper, so does the truth he's about to uncover. But in this house, the answers come with a price. And some doors should never be opened. Stay tuned for the next chapter of The Wanderer in the Mirror by Brandon Crowther.